Dr. Janet Woodcock is the director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the Food and Drug Administration. Very glad that you're here and that you sat in, obviously, on the first panel as well, and look forward to just some of the conversation about that. Pursuant to committee rules, we do swear in all of our witnesses before they testify, so if you please rise, raise your right hand. You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that the witness answered in the affirmative. Since you are the sole witness on this panel, we typically do a 5-minute time period on the clock. You're welcome to do that. We're going to receive your written testimony and be a part of the permanent record, but we're glad to be able to receive your oral testimony now. We won't be as attentive to the clock, and we'll follow up with questions from there. Thank you. We'll need you to hit the microphone, though.
I thought I had
it. There you go.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Spear, and distinguished member of the committee, I'm Janet Woodcock, who's head of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. This hearing explores current challenges in drug development and manufacturing, and given the critical role that medicines play in the health of our population, these, I think, are very important and timely issues. One challenge that the other panelists already alluded to is the escalating costs and time required to develop new therapies. This problem was identified in FDA's report on the critical path, identified in 2004, but has only really gotten more serious since that time. The root cause, in my opinion, probably in contradistinction to some of the panelists, can be boiled down to two major factors. The first is most investigational drugs that are taken into clinical trials are not successful. Perhaps 10% of the drugs get to the market, and about half of the drugs that are taken into phase 3 trials don't work or are too toxic and are dropped at that point, which is a very expensive point. This extremely expensive failure rate has been difficult to address, although companies have been trying to address this in the last decade. And also over this decade, we've been working with academia and the industry to try and improve drug development tools, including biomarkers and other tools that could help raise the success rate over this 10% mark. Until this happens, there are huge opportunity costs generated by this large scale of clinical failure. Now, the second factor is the hugely escalating costs of clinical trials, which have already been alluded to. Clinical development programs are plagued with multiple problems, including slow or no accrual at some sites, ever-increasing per-patient costs, patient shortages, and lack of data standards. The traditional clinical development program is inefficient and does not utilize the most up-to-date technologies. Patient access is limited because only sites at major medical centers enroll patients typically. FDA has been working on these problems. We've been working in the Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative, which is a consortium we have with Duke University and multiple other stakeholders. We've been working on data standards. And we've been working very intensively with groups that are doing new trials, such as the OSPI trial, which is an adaptive trial that is being done in breast cancer, and the new master protocol for lung cancer. And both of these trials are innovative because they study multiple different drugs in the same trial, and thus enable a lot of savings of setting up one trial after another for each investigational drug. And I'm happy to discuss any of this with you. Also, we've been talking about the use of telemedicine to better reach patients who live outside of major medical centers. Now, a second issue and challenge relates to modernizing drug manufacturing. The United States is no longer the world leader in drug manufacturing, like many other manufacturing sectors that we have lost. We rely on foreign sources around the world for drugs critical to the health of U.S. citizens. The trend of moving drug manufacturing offshore is continuing. However, we now may have a chance to reverse this trend. Modern manufacturing methods that have only recently become technically feasible allow for continuous manufacturing from drug synthesis to the final drug form, such as tablets or capsules. So you put in the raw chemicals at one end and you can get out pills at the other end. Such manufacturing requires much smaller but high-tech facilities staffed by a highly educated workforce. There's also a trend toward using a disposable manufacturing for the biologics, which again provides much savings. Environmental burdens for both of these are greatly diminished, and this was one of the barriers to continuing to building pharmaceutical plants in the United States. I believe the U.S. should do whatever is needed to incentivize this type of manufacturing sector growth in the United States. Both because we need better security of our drug supply and because it would provide a manufacturing sector that would be very valuable. The FDA has been encouraging and collaborating on this for about a decade, but I think there is now a unique opportunity. So there are multiple areas in which drug development continues to be a big challenge, and also manufacturing and maintaining the drug supply, and I'd be happy to discuss all of this with the committee.
Thank you. Let's run through a few questions. We'll take 5 minutes at a time, and then we'll come back through a second round of conversation as well. The sequestration issue has come up multiple times in this, the sequestration of the user fees themselves, fees that are paid by the companies to be able to expedite this. You and I have spoken on this before as well. What has been done at this point from FDA? Has there been communication with OMB to have a discussion about this? Because that is a user fee. And there is a lot of bipartisan frustration with OMB to say, why has that been sequestered as well? That was different from the start. Tell me about the communication that's happening right now between FDA and OMB.
Well, I believe the administration certainly has communicated within itself. This was a ruling by OMB that, according to how the budget is structured, that the user fees would be subject to sequestration, and that was done at the time the original sequestration was put into effect. Now, I realize members of Congress have written to OMB about this, and there has been multiple discussions, but it seems to be that it is felt that some type of overt action by Congress might be necessary to change this situation.
Has there been communication between FDA directly to OMB to talk about that, or is it just the assumption that that conversation is with OMB?
No, I'm sure that OMB, I personally haven't had those conversations, but I believe those conversations have been, OMB is quite aware of this situation.
Oh, yeah. Several comments have also come up on the President's recommendations. Recommendations from the study, there's several of them, again, that have been itemized as we've gone through the earlier panel as well. One of them, recommendation number 3, expand the use and practice of FDA's existing authorities for accelerated approval and confirmatory evidence. The FDA should make full use of accelerated approval for all drugs meeting the statutory standard of addressing an unmet need for a serious or life-threatening disease and demonstrating an impact on clinical endpoints other than survival or irreversible morbidity, or on a surrogate endpoint likely to predict clinical benefit. How is that coming in the conversation? I know you all have already looked at this as well. Where is that?
Yes, well, some of that was instantiated in FDAJA that was passed last year. And so we have issued a guidance on our expedited programs that further defines what unmet medical need is to make a standard definition of that. We are certainly have talked about and are working on the issue of clinical endpoints short of clinical benefit but are likely to predict clinical benefit. And we have full intent of applying accelerated approval to any area of unmet medical need. And I believe our breakthrough drug program that also was put in FDAJA demonstrates that we're very interested in this. Many of those have had clinical, potential clinical benefits based on surrogates and so forth.
Okay, so the guidance is being written currently on that. Tell me the time frame on this as far as when this moves from conversation and we're drafting to done.
The draft guidance is out for comment, and we should issue a final guidance soon.
Okay, soon being tomorrow, soon being 6 months?
Within months, I would expect. Mm-hmm.
Great. And then this ongoing conversation that has happened earlier that you're extremely aware of as well, this balance between safety and efficacy. access from patients coming in, whether it be the compassionate use that Mrs. Spear had mentioned before, or other methods to get patients that are terminal access to drugs faster, or even the information about the clinical trials out. So let me do two different sets of questions on that. One is the compassionate use and getting the information to doctors about how to go through that process and connecting and what the steps would be. And so that's an information part of it. The second part of it is the clinicaltrials.gov site. The information there, the access to that, helping more patients get involved in the trial process so they can be in the structure, so it not only helps them but helps others as well. Where are we on those two issues?
Well, clinicaltrials.gov is run by the National Library of Medicine and is intended to, among other things, alert patients or caregivers to where a trial might be opening up that they might be eligible for.
Do you consider that site up to date and the information accurate?
I think the site is up to date on the existence of the trials. There has been a lot of controversy about the results section of that and whether that's up to date. But if you're talking about patients being able to enter into the trials, except for phase 1 trials were not included. And so there may be some phase 1 trials, but those are dose escalation, early safety trials.
Yeah, it has all the beauty of Craigslist when you go there as far as a site itself and functionality, but the access to some of the results and the information is part of what my consideration is how do we make sure that people not only get good, accurate information there, but there's the possibility of they know about this early enough to get involved, and that physicians have the access to that information. They know it's very, very timely.
Well, I think that would be a matter of more publicity about the site through various patient groups, through other professional organizations that treat those given diseases so that the information is disseminated out in that manner.
Does FDA have a good relationship with those patient advocacy groups? Is there an ongoing communication there?
I have recently set up in the Center for Drugs a new office for patient advocacy relations and professional relations, and so we plan to be building that capacity within the Center for Drugs.
Okay, that'd be very helpful not only to patients but also to physicians as well.
Agreed.
For them and more information on that. I'm going to try to honor time on this and recognize Mrs. Spear.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and Dr. Woodcock, thank you for your decades and decades of service to our country and to the health of our country. Mr. Huber had mentioned in his testimony that the FDA clinical trials process is not suitable for new biologic and molecular medicines, and that it essentially results in economically incurable diseases. How is the FDA responding to these new medical technologies?
Well, I had a conversation with Mr. Huber. I don't agree with his analysis. We have been in the forefront of pushing molecular medicine since 2000. FDA, I can offer this for the record, recently put out a booklet on all the things we're doing on personalized medicine. But, for example, I think in 2003, I accepted the first award from the Personalized Medicine Coalition, really on behalf of the center for our work, first award they'd ever given for our work in driving personalized medicine along. And why would we do that? Because personalized medicine allows, because you try to eliminate people who don't respond, you increase the size of the treatment effect so that you actually see how well a drug works in people it has a chance in working. And then on the safety side, you can eliminate people in advance who are at risk. And so the drugs can become safer by screening out people who are at high risk of side effects. So from our point of view, and I think from patients' point of view, personalized medicine can only be a positive. We've in fact been criticized by some in the community for pushing it too hard. So I believe we really, and I believe it's paying off now. It's paying off with the targeted therapies. A lot of the breakthrough drugs are targeted therapies. And I think that we're going to see increasingly targeted medicines over the next decade.
Well, I appreciate that clarification. Now, Mr. Gottlieb also stated that he saw one of the greatest challenges for the FDA in terms of innovation was the culture. And he believed that there is significant influence exerted by outside groups upon the FDA clinical group. I'd like to give you the opportunity to respond to that.
Well, I certainly read Dr. Gottlieb's testimony. I've had conversations with him about this. And of course, FDA has considerable flexibility in applying the safety and efficacy standards. And we basically use a sliding scale. So for a headache, a drug has to be pretty safe, because no one wants to risk their life to, cure their headache, right? On the other hand, for serious and life-threatening diseases where there isn't any alternatives, there's a lot of tolerance of risk, and there's also greater tolerance of uncertainty about the effects, which is what Dr. Gottlieb was talking about. And as I understand his comment, it's very similar to what you said, which is that a lot of the criticisms over the years about drug safety issues have, in his mind, led to conservatism, even on this area, in the area where a lot of flexibility is indicated.
So give us some good news, because I think there is some good news coming out of FDA, and particularly your area. So tell us from your perspective some of the good news.
Well, I think from my point of view, the good news is that the industry, we're really seeing, I think, a renaissance in the industry. We're approving a lot of drugs now that are first in class, or that are treating untreatable diseases, or that advances in therapy, and they're treating bad diseases better. The breakthrough program that was put in place by Congress last year, we've had over 100, I believe, requests, and we've granted 34. And those designations that we give are where we think the drug is really a game changer in that disease. And if we grant that designation, we offer to really do a full court press on that drug and do everything we can to get it developed, basically in the most, I call it, parsimonious manner possible. In other words, what is the shortest path between where the drug is now, what we know about it, and what we need to know to get it on the market in the hands of doctors and patients. And I think there's a lot of enthusiasm both internally and externally about this breakthrough drug program and the promise of these drugs.
Okay, let's talk about manufacturing for a moment. It's pretty stunning, and I think if the American people knew that 40% of the drugs that we take are manufactured outside of the country, and 80% of the ingredients are manufactured outside of the country, they'd be pretty appalled, because there's just consternation about the supervision and oversight that goes on overseas. So tell us, and to your point, when there are shortages and there are tsunamis and there's other conditions that prevent us from accessing the drugs that our population needs, we're really left with a very difficult position to be in. So how do we create more opportunities for manufacturing, or what's it going to take? I mean, I'm thrilled that Apple Computer has decided to bring jobs back to America. I might actually buy more Apple products now. But that was a ways in coming, and part of it's because we're now seeing transportation costs are more expensive. There's lots of reasons why, on the bottom line, they're doing that. How can we create incentives for manufacturers to be manufacturing in the United States?
Well, that's a very good question, and because I'm not an economist, I'm not probably the best person to consult. What I'm going to say is that FDA is trying to provide encouragement for advanced manufacturing wherever it might be, because it's going to be safer, it's going to be reliable, it's going to enable personalized medicine, because it's going to be much more agile than the kind of manufacturing we have right now. But I do believe that it should be considered, incentives should be considered, and states should consider this as perhaps an industry they would want to put in place incentives to bring back into the state, because I believe this will be a viable sector for a very long time, making drugs. But the technology, I'm here to say that the technology has reached a point where this is reality, where we can see these plants can be built, they can decrease our vulnerability in the sense that we're relying on foreign sites of supply that may have many different things that might happen that mean the drug might become unavailable in the United States, and yet it's also a very good, I think, source of jobs.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Mr. Meehan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Woodcock, I want to thank you, too, for your long, distinguished career working in this area, and congratulations for your recognition. It's nice to be to receive an award. That's one of the few benefits of public service, that you don't get the compensation sometimes in other ways. But I want to step off of the questioning that my good friend and colleague from California was asking you, because you made a comment about the industry now expanding in Europe and other places and not here. But why do you think that is?
My understanding, it's primarily they're setting up plants in India, China, and many other parts of the developing world. And I don't know, as I said, I'm not an economic expert, but the analyses that have been published about this say that it's the environmental regulations, certain tax advantages, a lower cost labor force, and the usual kind of factors that we see with manufacturing moving offshore from here. However, the new manufacturing methods require a high-tech labor force. They will have low environmental impact. It'll be much diminished, all right? And it'll require not a very large footprint of size of a factory to operate. And so is more like the kind of innovative high-tech industries that we really do see coming back to the United States, or we'd like to retain in the U.S.
What do we do? I mean, I accept the analysis. I don't have a better analysis of it, and I suspected and do believe that it includes all among those, including tax policies and other things, but I do hear as well the time that it takes from somebody who has effectively a startup concept to have it moved through Europe and approved and put into you know, the chain of treatment, so to speak, is much shorter than what we deal with in the United States. And you talked about time and cost being an expanded aspect of FDA. So, or at least the process here, which FDA participates in. And since we hopefully can deal with those other issues as well at some point in time, tax policy and other things, what can we do to do a better job of enabling the FDA to be timely in their response? Or are you doing it correct? I'm moved by your point that only 10% of the drugs actually get approved, that there are good reasons why it's appropriate to make sure we don't put bad products out. But what's the difference between what Europe's doing and here? Why can they do it faster and we can't?
Which part do you say they're doing faster?
Well, it's my understanding, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, that there is an ability to take a startup idea and move it through the clinical trials and get it to a point where it can be approved and put into commerce quicker than is done here. And that is one of the driving forces, is the tremendous cost associated and the time delay. That if you can manufacture, get the drug approved and begin to manufacture and getting in, once it starts to work, it'll find its way back here to the United States. But we've lost the jobs and the other kinds of things that are associated with the development of the industry.
Well, we keep figures on what you call the new molecular entities, the novel drugs, right, and where they're approved first in the world. And consistently over the past at least 5 years, we've led the world in approvals of first on the market. And we're above Europe. We're not in any competition with Europe, but we're about 50–60% of all, compared to all other markets. And each sector, Japan, Europe has a smaller percentage, up to 100%. Last year, I think we were at 60% of all new molecular entities. I can get you that figure, all right? But so I'm not sure. That used to be, before the user fee program, PDUFA, FDA approved drugs much later than in Europe, but that hasn't been true for some time. Now, as far as manufacturing, we have more or less the same manufacturing regulations as Europeans. So if a plant can be got up quicker in Europe, it would do with other permitting and other regulations related probably. But generally, the manufacturing is going to India, China, other places, Brazil.
My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to a round of follow-up questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And we will. And Dr. Woodcock, if you don't mind, we're just going to open up microphones and just have an ongoing conversation. So there may be multiple of us instead of a structured time period. That has been our habit, I would say, here once we get into the second round. So we'll just start throwing questions at you back and forth. You had mentioned first about the approval process faster here for some of the types, faster than Europe or Japan, and that has changed over the last several years. Is that still true for all types, or are there certain types where Europe and Japan are still approving drugs faster than we are?
Well, since I'm under oath,
Yes.
my impression is that because of the user fee program, we have deadlines. We approve most of the drugs on the first cycle. All right, so it's submitted in. The companies have really figured out what they need to give to us to get an approval, and we have timelines for when. And I think my impression is for all the types of new drug applications, we are ahead of other countries.
Okay. Your ideas to bring down the cost. As I walk through the several issues of this particular hearing and getting a chance to explore and where FDA is moving on this and what's happening, the cost of drugs is significant. Every one of those companies say it's because of the cost of actually the trials process and everything else. So your ideas that you have seen to bring down the cost of that. I also want to ask you several other questions, but can we spend a little time on that?
Certainly. To bring down the costs, we have been working on this for at least a decade. And recently, my idea of having these standing trials where many drugs could be tested in the same trial, and you just keep running them through instead of setting up a new trial for every drug. That is extremely expensive and time-consuming. And the goal then would be to reach out to the community and enroll patients all through the United States, not limit it to major medical centers. So more patients have the opportunity. That decreases the time taken to recruit patients.
Who has done that at this point? How many have done that? Is that a pilot issue that you're working with, or how would companies know that they can try that?
It has to be done by consortia, all right? And the OSPI trial, I think the OSPI 2 trial was the pioneer in this, okay? And that was in...
Where was that done?
It's led out of UCSF and through the Foundation for NIH as a consortium, all right? So many companies, the FDA, the NIH, everybody be a part of that, set up that trial. It's a screening trial, and they screen breast cancer drugs again with a biomarker to the point about personalized medicine. So they take high-risk breast cancer patients, and they're trying to improve the treatment so they can screen many drugs. And I won't go into how that's designed. And then another one is now being set up by the National Cancer Institute, the FNIH, and FDA's participating in this for lung cancer, where many patients can be recruited, and they already have 5 drugs, and all investigational drugs, that they'll be testing using biomarkers in that trial. Okay. So those are prototypes, but it is not widely adopted yet.
But that's obviously in an area where you're going to have a lot of patients and a lot of opportunity. You mentioned breast cancer, lung cancer. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, we have a lot of people in that. Mm-hmm. What can be done in some of the other drug processes where we don't have as many people in?
Well, in rare diseases, I think certain groups like the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation have led the way, all right? We recently approved a drug for cystic fibrosis, and that's a rare disease to start with, but only treats 7% of those patients. But that Cystic Fibrosis Foundation already had the patients all genotyped, so we were able to identify, the company who was developing the drug was able to identify which patients that drug might work in and rapidly test them. And so that drug is approved and on the market for cystic fibrosis.
So what kind of time period and cost did that change for that? That went from 12 years, 10 years, I would assume is a typical process?
Yeah, I think it was remarkably shortened, but I can't tell you how short that was. Okay, they did randomized trial because this was a very novel approach, right. And they were able to show in a 48-week trial that they really improved markers for cystic fibrosis, lung function, and the children gained weight. So another idea that we have also is we've been discussing, and I know you all have been discussing with the community, is a way to speed the introduction of antibiotics for
Yes.
drug-resistant organisms. And that is a different idea that's been discussed, which is putting some kind of mark or logo or having Congress speak to a special mechanism that we would have a very limited drug development program, get those drugs into the hands of doctors, all right, for serious drug-resistant organism infections, and have some kind of notation or mark on those drugs so that the doctors knew they had been developed by a very limited program and that good antibiotic stewardship should be used with them.
Okay. Only antibiotics in that program, though.
Well, that it's been discussed wider, and I think that's a matter for ongoing discussion. But that would be one way to do it. Would be start because the need is very great. The CDC said, I think last year, I believe they said 23,000 people died from infections with drug-resistant organisms, and we are behind that epidemic. As you have said, it takes a while to develop a drug, even if we shorten the time. And so we don't have time, anymore. We're running out of time to get a handle on this epidemic.
Okay, so clarify that for me, because you said we're working on several times there. Is this a process that is set, that you've done guidelines for, that's done, or what again, what is the time frame on this? Is this done tomorrow? Is this done 6 months, 6 years from now?
Yeah, what we've been discussing is that Congress would speak on this and tell us to establish a program, and that's what...
You do not have the statutory authority to do that right now, you feel, or?
We would require regulations.
But if we did statute, you would have to promulgate regulations off that statute as well.
I'm not a lawyer, so I always get, being under oath, I don't want to give you an exact answer, but I think we could probably do it with the statute if it were, we might have to do guidance to help companies figure out how to do the programs, but I believe that we could probably implement something if we were directed to in a statute directly.
Okay. I'll just make sure. Others.
Dr. Woodcock, the experience that Gilead just had, where it had their hepatitis C drug approved with the recommendation by FDA to do additional trials, I believe, with a different cohort. Maybe you could just explain, because it was unusual, but it showed flexibility within FDA, and Gilead was thrilled with the opportunity to kind of move that process quickly, and I think it would be good for all of us to understand it.
I'd have to get back to you on that because I don't know the details of it, but I will say that you asked for good news. I think the new generation of drugs for hepatitis that we're going to see is really good news because we have a lot of patients in this country who develop liver failure from hepatitis or develop liver cancer. And we believe that new generation of drugs may well be curative of hepatitis C, and that's really big news.
And it's big news on a lot of levels because they become disability insurance recipients and Medicaid recipients and Medicare recipients, and that is a very costly procedure that they then go through in terms of dialysis and the like. So that's good. Let me ask you this. You said that only 10% of the drugs that are considered actually get approved because there's a failure in phase 3. Can you explain that to us? Is there some way we can find that out sooner so there's not as much money invested by the drug companies?
That's the $64,000 question. All right, what happens is there's attrition all the way through the drug development process. The attrition before you get into people, say you do animal studies or something and you find toxicity, that's not that expensive. But once you start doing trials, losing a drug somewhere during the clinical development program is very expensive. And the longer you go and study the drug, the more sunk cost you have in that drug. And so in phase 1, there's attrition, often for toxicity. In phase 2, there may be attrition because the drug doesn't work. But remarkably, in phase 3, at least several years ago, the last time this was studied, there's about 50% of attrition is in phase 3 when you've spent a huge amount, maybe, up upwards of $1 billion on developing the drug, and you find out it doesn't work. Some of the drugs in phase 3 don't have any effect compared to placebo.
So, but is that because for the first time they're being used on human beings? Because they're being used on human beings in phase 2, are they not? Mm-hmm. So what is happening?
It's hard. For some diseases, you can't tell in phase 2. All you're doing in phase 2 is trying to get the dose right, maybe using a biomarker to try and figure out, are you affecting the disease? But the disease may be a longer-term disease, or it may take a while, and so you have to do a phase 3 trial to see whether or not it actually works or not, and then you're very sadly disappointed. For example, we just had a couple trials in Alzheimer's disease, that did not affect Alzheimer's disease, and that is a bitter disappointment because we need treatments for Alzheimer's disease, but it's hard to tell in earlier trials whether or not you're affecting dementia.
Can I jump in on this as well?
Sure.
Going back to a statement that Mr. Huber made earlier, where he talked about the drug that was set up for kidneys, and they were using it for bladders, and it was not successful in anyone but one, and it was flawless on that one. Is that the type of thing that we're finding, or we're finding it's effective on some, or so we're looking for the molecular markers for that group, and why you had 500 people in the study and it worked great on 12 and not on the rest, and so now you're studying it, or you're blanket saying this doesn't work for everyone?
It really varies by the disease, all right. In Alzheimer's, we don't really have any good molecular markers yet, and that's what those biomarkers are working on. So those studies are what you call empirical. In other words, they're trial and error, and that's a lot of the problem with drug development. It's still trial and error. But in cancer, because we did the war on cancer that you all funded, and we have a tremendous amount of information about what makes that cancer a cancer. And as Mr. Huber was saying, it's molecular changes, genetic changes in the tumor that do that, and some of them are driving the cancerous behavior. And if we can target that and turn it off, then the cancer subsides to some extent. And so that's a new way of developing a drug where you actually understand the mechanism and you can target that mechanism. And so in cancer, we used to talk about breast cancer and colon cancer, but now we really talk about what is a driver, what mutation is driving that tumorous behavior, and how can we turn that off. So that's been a revolution, and I think that's going to get better and better, but we need to focus on curing cancers.
Right. No, the point I'm trying to drive at, though, is in a large-scale study, it's a phase 3, you have a lot of people that are involved in it. What do you do if you have a small group in there that it is successful for, that is effective, but statistically across the size of the group, it's not there? Is that something the drug company goes back to the drawing board and tries to determine that, or is it something FDA is involved? What happens?
Usually the companies will submit subgroup analyses, and they would give them a hypothesis. Well, maybe it works in this group. Okay, we don't know why, but maybe it works in this group. And they would have to do more trials. Why? Okay. Well, I mean, a famous example, Richard Peto, who's a statistician in the UK, did a subset analysis of a trial, and he showed that people with the astrological sign Virgo, okay, did much better, okay, than all the other people. And people say, well, you should approve the drug based on these subset analyses, but the actual fact is you can do many of them, and there's always going to be one that the drug appears to work, and we see this all the time. That doesn't necessarily mean it actually does work, just like the astrological sign Virgo is not a predictor of better cardiovascular outcomes. So yes, if there is a convincing molecular marker, though, okay, that's a hard scientific thing, not some kind of fishing expedition, then we might have a different approach.
Can we talk about your staffing? Is all of your staffing, I should know this and don't, subject to user fees, or is there a percentage that is not subject to user fees?
We have S&E funding that is subject to sequestration. We have PDUFA funding, and we have GDUFA, the Generic Drug User Fee Program, has just set up funding, and funding for biosimilars drug user fee. S&E is maybe about 30% of our funding.
S&E is?
The appropriated, the taxpayers' dollars is
It's about 30%. So what does that mean in terms of sequestration? I mean, how many jobs are no longer being?
Yeah, I wish I could remember these figures, but it's been a pretty significant hit that we've taken. Now, we're able to hire under GDUFA anyway, but what you've been talking about here about the interaction of companies, innovator companies, with the review divisions has been hampered because those review divisions did not get the hires expected under the new PDUFA program because of the sequester.
The generic group, you're still able to hire, that money was not sequestered?
I'm very confused about this, but I know that we had so many hires that we had to make that we certainly are able to hire under GDUFA. I don't know, I don't understand. We could get back to you on the impact of the sequester on GDUFA.
The question is, were the user fees sequestered for the generic or not sequestered for the generic? Do you know? You've made some hires there. I just didn't know if that's a function of the user fees.
I think the answer is yes and no. I think at the first year they weren't, maybe because it was a new program. That's why I'm confused.
Okay.
And then it will be, but we can.
Can we follow up on that? Because obviously it has been this ongoing conversation of should the user fees have been sequestered at all.
Yeah.
Okay. Pat, did you have other things you want to add in?
Yeah.
Jump in anytime.
Well, I don't want to jump in while you're on a roll. You've got some, and I kind of laughed to myself when you were hesitant to answer the question because you said I'm not a lawyer. I was just with a guy. He said he saw the high-priced lawyer and he asked me. He said, "Hey, I've got 2 quick questions. If I give you $1,000, can I ask you?" And the guy said, "Absolutely. What's your second question?" So, little levity to help us. As a recovering lawyer, I have to take chances. But the information that or the sort of the dialogue I exchanged with Dr. Gottlieb, among others, was not just anecdotal, dealing with the concerns about the timeliness of responsiveness, and you didn't really have a chance to talk to it. And I think it has sometimes to do with the ease with which it is just to ask one more question and send it back. What can be done to assure that those who are managing their portfolios, particularly in light of the fact that PDUFA and MDUFA have been put in place to ameliorate just this issue, that we are getting timely and responsive communication? And maybe it is just as Mr. Hastings identified, better communication all along. But I'm talking from knowledge of specifics, where there would be communication and, in effect, send me what you have. 28 days, no response, 29th day, the whole new raft of questions. So how, as an agency, can you oversee to assure that those who are managing their portfolios are doing it effectively?
Well, it is a complicated question. These interactions are governed by agreements that are made under PDUFA, many of them, all right? And we track something like 25,000 transactions, all right, every year. Don't quote me on this, or something like that, or I can't give you the exact number, right? But it is a very large number of transactions that occur because we track not only all the filings for the marketing applications, but we have type A, B, and C meetings, and we track how timely the meeting minutes are to get back on these meetings, how timely the scheduling of the meetings are, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very micromanaged. But again, that's the process, it's not the content. And I will say, in my opinion, if you pay too much attention to process, you often give short shrift to content. And to me, that seems to underlie your question, too.
It did. I mean, I think that was the example, that once they got somebody else to step in and took the time to evaluate it, they realized the information was there and it was sufficiently explained. But I just appreciate the process, but I do think it's this balance of when people feel comfortable to make decisions. And I do adopt my colleagues' concerns that obviously people have come and been lambasted for having made the wrong decision, and it creates an environment in which people say, well, no decision is easier on me, so they don't do it. How do we have to work together to assure that that happens? One of the things that I'm interested in, I just have a couple follow-up questions. The President's Council on Science and Technology put together their innovation package, and they had 8 recommendations. I'm looking forward to going into greater detail into that, but you've been through it. What do you think, what stood out with you, to you, in that report, and what do you think we can work with you on to help do a better job of getting, more effective cures to the market?
Well, I think some of the things that Congress has already sort of instantiated in FDACIA around accelerated approval that already alluded to have been helpful in giving us and having us pay more attention to our expedited programs. The other thing that struck me about the proposals in the PCAST report were a call for more translational science, because it's hard for us to make decisions if the if the science isn't there.
What do you mean by translational science?
Well, there's basic science. You can say, well, this pathway inside of a cell does this and that and the other thing. And then there's translational science, which said this biomarker really is predictive of a good outcome. If we had, the more data a company or we have on that, the more confident everyone feels that we can, put our money down on that, right? But if we have no data, or say the rare diseases you're talking about, we don't have any data on the natural history of the rare disease, what people do is get a bunch of experts together and say, in my opinion, the disease progresses in this manner. Now, that's been a problem, not just for us, for the companies, because it turns out the disease does not progress in that manner, and therefore their study they designed, didn't work. It wasn't long enough, or it didn't measure the right things or whatever. And so that's translational science, is a science that supports actually studying the drug in people and actually enables you to study the drug effectively and quickly. So PCAST called for a formation of a consortium where everyone would work together to enable this translational science and move it along, and I think that would be very helpful. I also think this other mechanism I already talked about for antibiotics would also be helpful in dealing with some part of that epidemic.
Pat, can I jump in as well? Help me understand again why you think you need a statute for the antibiotics in the new process, why you don't feel like you already have statutory authority to do that, based on so many other areas with the breakthrough, with the accelerated process, with all those things that are already in place. Why do you need another statute for that?
I think we have statutory authority, or we could claim we did, and do a regulation. That would take many years. In my experience nowadays.
Have you noticed how long it takes to get a bill through Congress?
Well, I just have great faith in you.
That makes one. My concern is deadlocked as we are in so many different areas. My preference, and I'm not going to speak for all of us, would be you get started on what you feel like you have statutory authority for now, and so we can have something in process. Right. We have a responsibility to get our stuff done as well, but that has not gone as smoothly as it should, and that we are capable of, obviously. And I would hate for FDA to sit back for 2 or 3 years and wait on us to get something done, and then once it's done, you have to promulgate rules based on that, and then we're even farther behind.
Yeah. Well, we certainly, we had a public meeting on this, which is often a prelude to rulemaking. We have certainly been in discussions with companies that are interested in utilizing this pathway.
Okay. I do not want you to try to feel like I'm saying to you, though, leave statutory authority. If you do not have statutory authority, obviously don't go outside of statutory authority. But if you have it and you feel like you already have it, validate it, and I would encourage you to get moving on it. So again, I'm not going to try to speak for all of us, but while we do have a responsibility, things have bogged down significantly here. Fairly obvious, I think.
I have a question. There was a period of time in the not-so-distant past when a number of companies had come to me with questions about their approval when they had 2 drugs that had been previously approved by the FDA. They were combining them for obesity, and were having either a difficult time getting it approved or actually getting it denied, even though both of those drugs independently had already been approved by FDA. Can you talk about that on the one hand, and also about where we are in terms of obesity drugs, because we all know this is a huge issue in terms of American health? Certainly.
Well, when you...
And I need a quick fix.
We've had a lot of obesity drugs have to be pulled off the market for safety problems. And primarily they were cardiovascular safety problems. And so I think the FDA is trying to exercise caution on new obesity drugs, but recognize there is this is another epidemic that we're facing that needs some kind of new thinking as far as how to deal with it. When you have drugs, the sliding scale I talked to you about before, so if you have a drug that's indicated for seizures, say, that drug's benefit risk will be looked at in the light of what is epilepsy, what are the available treatments, who might use it, how much risk would they be willing to take, okay, to control their seizures. If you move a seizure drug or a drug for heart failure or something over to obesity, you say to yourself, 30% of all adult Americans have obesity. How much risk of uncertainty of, say, heart attacks or strokes are we willing to take in that population? All right, that's just an example. I'm not, versus where you're treating epilepsy where the people are facing risks if they continue to have seizures, right? And that's the conundrum that we're in. These drugs that we would approve for obesity, very large, millions of Americans might be exposed to them, and they need to be relatively safe, unless, again, we were able to restrict them to the very people suffering from the most severe types of obesity. But that would be unlikely given the prevalence of a condition in the United States. In fact, we initially talked about this limited use scenario that we're talking about for antibiotics, also for obesity, because the benefit risk for somebody who's severely obese is different than someone with mild obesity, or somebody who's severely obese and has a lot of morbidities from it. They have heart disease, they have severe arthritis, mobility problems, and so forth. So the problem with, I think, obesity drugs is that eating is such a basic human instinct and function. Any drug that's going to significantly interfere with that is going to have powerful effects and may have effects in multiple domains. And we need a lot of creativity in that area to move forward.
We get into the issue of FDA making decisions for doctors and the labeling issues and the warnings and that kind of such. And I know that's a constant struggle for you because you're testing for a certain thing and you haven't tested for other things. You put that into the market and physicians may use it off-label. Mm-hmm. How is that moving within FDA? And quite frankly, with your opinion in the culture of FDA, do you feel like you're clamping down on labeling and adding more? Because there's this barrier between, do you restrict more or do you give more information to doctors and just overload them with information and say, read it, make the decision because you're going to go off-label anyway? Or is it stronger off-labels, don't use it, restrict it from FDA's perspective?
Well, generally speaking, and I think this isn't well understood, but FDA accepts the fact that off-label use can be appropriate, and that's a part of the practice of medicine for most drugs, okay? There are drugs that we have special restrictions that are called REMS, and these were put in as part of the FDA legislation 6 years ago, I believe. And the REM, and we had them before, where through regulation, where you'd restrict distribution of a drug. And sometimes you have to say, we're only using it for this. And a premier example is like the drug Accutane, that's for severe acne. It's a very effective drug, and severe acne can be a really bad condition, but it was widely used for all kind of acne because it works, right? But it's a major human teratogen, and so it causes major birth defects if used in a pregnant woman. And we were getting reports every year of use in pregnant women, every year. Even women who were started on the drug and never had a pregnancy test. So we, put gradually more and more restrictions in. Now that drug is highly restricted and that you have to get pregnancy tests before, or not be of childbearing potential to get Accutane if you're a woman. And we hate to do that because that really burdens the healthcare system. On the other hand, we have some of these very dire side effects that the healthcare system has not shown itself to be capable of managing without further intervention. So you're right, we walk a narrow line there. We don't want to overly restrict, but sometimes the side effects are so dire, and it might be that the drug might not be available unless we had that restricted program in place.
Can we speak about pediatric cancer for a moment? There's, within the NIH budget, less than 4% of the funding goes to the research around pediatric cancer, and there's a lot of off-label use of drugs for pediatric cancer. Mm-hmm. So can you just give us a sense of where FDA is in terms of evaluating drugs for peds, as they refer to them?
Yeah. Well, we've had a strong pediatric program because of Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act and BPCA, and so there's been quite a response by the pharmaceutical industry to those programs, and they get extra exclusivity if they fulfill certain requirements. So for many conditions, we just celebrated 500 drug labels that have been updated with pediatric information. Now, that said, though, pediatric cancer is different. And why? Because a cancer arising in a child is usually not the same as the adult condition. And these pediatric programs were set up to study conditions that occur in adults and then study them lower and lower ages and then get that information. But it stands to reason that the kind of mutation that would occur in a child, when they're just born or when they're young, is different than the kind of mutations that occur over a lifetime in a cell type and cause cancer. So that progression that we see in other diseases hasn't happened as much in the pediatric diseases, and I believe the pediatric community, cancer community, is concerned about this. We've tried to encourage companies to study right away drugs in childhood cancers if they seem appropriate. Often you'd study a disease in adults first and then study children, but in fact, when you have a life-threatening disease like cancer, it's appropriate to study the children right away also. But the question is, what is the right drug for that cancer in children? I personally believe that the genomic revolution that we were talking about earlier, where we begin to understand the sequences and the driving mutations in the cancers, is really going to help us. But we also are finding some of the pediatric cancers are actually multiple diseases put together, just like adult cancers. So we have a pediatric oncologist, a very senior pediatric oncologist on staff at the Center for Drugs, and we are really trying to encourage development in this area.
You had a question too?
Just a final question, and maybe it's not fair to even ask it, and if you don't want to respond, don't, but thinking outside the box, I mean, you labor in the vineyard, and there must be times where you sit and think, if we built the mousetrap a little different way, maybe we could have success. And I'm asking the question sort of guided by the fact that you're hearing some of these wealthy industrialists or others who are saying that with their life's savings now, they want to be the person, for instance, that cures Alzheimer's, and they're going to put everything into this effort. And I don't know whether that is the kind of thing that we ought to be encouraging, where we say, let's just cure Alzheimer's. Let's create this Center for Excellence that does it. Let's keep it here in the United States so they don't send it overseas to do it, which they're referring to. Does that make sense, or are we better off doing what we're doing, trying to not choose winners and losers?
Well, that's a really profound question, I think. I mean, I really can't give advice to Congress. I believe that the patient advocacy groups in many diseases have made tremendous strides in advancing the treatments and cures for their diseases. So that disease focus can be very beneficial in getting a disease, getting treatments advanced and so forth. And they've done a great job, partly because they understand what's needed. And often what's needed is these clinical trial networks, getting the outcome measures, doing the natural history, really understanding the disease very well. So when treatments come along, they don't fail. They can be tested rapidly and figure out how desirable they are.
You've mentioned communication a number of times. Are we missing opportunities in this age of the ability of the NSA to drill down into the most intimate details anywhere? But no, we're collecting more information than we've ever done before. We've got the ability to assimilate information better than we have before, and we're creating more medical records, albeit there's still too much on paper and other kinds of things. But with this bulk of records out there, are we losing an opportunity to mine what we already know to significantly enhance or advance the ability to understand the things that we're trying to take on?
I don't know. Often the medical records, for example, aren't detailed and standardized well enough to provide these natural history outcomes that we'd really like to have. We have the Sentinel system that we've set up, which is really pretty, I think, novel and innovative. We have 120 million lives of data, all behind the firewalls of the data partners, the insurance companies or healthcare systems. But we have it all standardized. We can query it, and we use that for drug safety analysis. Okay, so we use that existing data, and they're starting to cluster randomize within these kind of systems and answer important questions by doing experiments out there. I believe that telemedicine and recruiting people through social media and so forth is probably something we really should do, and that would be a way to really reach patients who are out there and whose doctors aren't telling them or they don't know about availability of trials and so forth. And I think we just started to scratch the surface on how well that can serve us.
Well, I thank you. I guess we could go on all day, but I am very, very grateful for the work that you do and for your presentations here today. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, for holding this hearing.
Actually, the gentleman from Pennsylvania just triggered, and your response triggered a question for me. The clinicaltrials.gov, is that, at Google, you can actually elevate your status, so to speak, by paying for it. And so if you were to Google cancer, you can have clinicaltrials.gov come up first. Who would be responsible for making that decision as to whether or not that should be an expenditure we make?
That site's maintained by the National Library of Medicine, it's part of NIH.
Okay, so that's a question to ask them. Let me just conclude, Mr. Chairman, by saying that I think we've got just a gold mine in you, Dr. Woodcock, and I thank you for the competency and professionalism that you've showed for so very long. And I hope that this will be a beginning of an opportunity for us to find more ways to work together. And I really think that pursuing the manufacturing of drugs here in the United States is worthy of our time and attention, and your assistance would be greatly appreciated.
Absolutely.
I'd agree with that as well. And I also want to thank you for the time to be able to spend here and the time both in preparation of your written statements. You made a comment earlier that you don't give advice to Congress. Again, that would be one of the few Americans that doesn't do that. That's the wonderful thing about a republic. Everyone can give advice to Congress. But through this, there were a lot of to-dos that come out of this. Let me give one statement just from me on it. You're doing a lot of pilots. You're doing some outside-the-box thinking of what can we do on that. We want to encourage that and to say continue to do that. The companies, we have a lot of companies that are now IPOs that are jumping in with different ideas. We want to continue to encourage the innovation that helps everyone. I'd also like to continue to encourage you, as you've already started a new office, in communicating with the advocacy groups for each of these different diseases. They want the communication with you.
Yes.
As much as you can spur that, and then also connect the dots between groups. For instance, what's happened, as you mentioned before, with the cystic fibrosis organization, there may be others that are interested in that may not even know that is occurring. But if it fast tracks that, and if there are ways that these different outside groups can do, they're looking for things that will help. If there are things you can clearly articulate that would help, they would like to know that. And they need to be able to hear that from you. They're very connected to NIH in the funding. They need to be connected to you in the same way to know not only what's the research out there that's being done, once the research is done, how can we fast-track solutions?
That's right.
So I would encourage that, as well as increased information to physicians on clinical trials, so that for these rare diseases especially, physicians know about the clinical trial process and can get their patients into it, be much better than the compassionate use in other ways, and we can have the research ongoing on it. So those are quick admonitions in that. But you need to let us know as well what we need to do statutorily, and we'll continue the conversation about the antibiotics. But if there are things that you need from us, we want to help in that, and we'll work in a bipartisan way to be able to get that done. So with that, without no other questions on the dais on that, this hearing is adjourned.